or anything like that? Where do the excess funds go for the program?
Sure. The excess funds, there's a couple different funding sources that are set up under the law that enacted or that implemented the 2016 ballot. One piece of it is that there's a piece of it is tax revenue that'll end up going to the state. I don't remember off the top of my head if it goes to the general fund or if it's earmarked, but there's definitely a chunk that goes to the state. And then another chunk is something that a town or city could pass by local ordinance or by local rule, opting into a separate tax that would go directly to the municipality. And then beyond that is the issue of that every operator, I mentioned earlier that there are municipal issues. One of the big ones is that every operator has to negotiate a host community agreement with the municipality. And it's kind of the document that's going to govern the relationship between the operator and the city or town. And in that case, the host community agreement almost always involves a fee that's based on a percentage of gross revenues. And that's where that money, again, would go directly to the town or city, and they would use it either based on their general law or they would do it based on whatever commitments are agreed to in a host community agreement. So that's where the money would go. So part of it would be the taxes to the state, part of it would be the optional tax at the local level, and then there's the issue of the local fees through the host community agreement.
Right. Well, the reason that I was asking is because if there's a portion of the revenues that go toward a general state fund, if a municipality opts out, and let's say the state fund was dog-eared for something like education, sort of the way it is in Colorado, if a town opts out, then would they be able to draw from those state funds down the road? Or would they be excluded from that because they excluded the businesses from their municipality?
Yeah, I don't know that that's set yet. I think that's something that's being discussed. I think, again, the legislative session in Massachusetts is a 2-year cycle. And so the legislation this year is going to be looking closely at the initial experience of the first 9 months of legalized cannabis. And that's why I think one of the issues they're thinking about is, is there something that if a town opts out of the process entirely, should they be limited in terms of having access to the cannabis-related tax revenues that's there? And it's also a little bit tricky because there's a separate issue that towns can prohibit. They also, in certain cases, can limit, the ability of licensees to operate in their town. So I guess you may have a rule saying that people who prohibit out and out can't share, but what about the people who say only authorize 2 or 3 licenses in a given town? Does that mean that they, as opposed to, the capacity in the town to have 5 or 6 or 7 licenses, should you proportionally limit that? And would that be difficult to calculate? So I think there's a few things that the state senators and the state House folk will have to figure out. I should note, by the way, that one of the counsel we have at our firm is the guy named Dave Rogers, who is a member of the House. He's actually the chair of the newly formed Cannabis Committee that'll be proposing legislation for general purposes. And so I'm sure that's going to be something that Dave and his Senate co-chair and the committee members will have to do some serious thinking about in the upcoming legislative session.
That's interesting that your firm's going to be involved in that process. Do you have outreach programs for the public to make commentary?
That's a good question on that. I mean, at the legislative level, it'll be subject to the ordinary hearing process. When, the legislation is put forward, committees are there, they'll take testimony from individuals and groups, and there'll be a public entry point in that. And I know that the members of the legislature are meeting actively with the commissioners at the Cannabis Control Commission and other people who are involved in the industry to be able to make sure they get a full sense of what's going on before they actually formulate legislation to refine what's happening in the regulatory scheme at the statutory level, or, turning from the legislative into the regulatory piece. The Cannabis Control Commission has been a pretty outward-facing agency since it started up. It's been very interested in public input. When it drafted the initial regulations, it put them out in draft form. It solicited comments from the multitudes, both in written form and in public hearing processes. our firm put in comments on some technical issues in the initial rules. They ended up, coming out with the rules, and since then they also have a couple of different subcommittees with industry experts that feed information into them that they use for policy making. And now the commission is teeing up some regulatory changes that'll be actually kicked off later this week. And
Wow.
then
So when you say they're kicking off this week, is it committee meetings or how does that work?
it's going to be proposed rules. And they came up with a report about a month ago that said that they wanted to do a few things. Part of it, I guess, ties back to their draft rules back in December of 2017. Their initial set of rules had a couple. The rules themselves now have a whole variety of license types. You can be a retailer, you can be a cultivator, you can be a manufacturer, you can be a craft cannabis provider, so you can have your own high-end particular form of cultivation, and there's special rules that would apply to that. They have micro businesses, which are for smaller businesses that might potentially have some lower fees and easier entry, although there's a separate issue of whether that's really that effective. But the thing that they had in the initial rules were that they wanted to come up with the idea of how to do delivery only. In other words, you'd be a licensee who wouldn't have a storefront. Could you just deliver cannabis? That's one concept. And the other one was for cannabis cafes, or what they call kind of social use or social consumption, that you can actually have a cannabis place where people can consume cannabis on site. It can either be a predominantly cannabis only cafe. They held open the option of even having it co-located with other uses, like you have a yoga studio that would have a cannabis license, or a gaming place that would have the ability to serve cannabis to the gamers in there. And I think they thought that was a bit of a bridge too far in the initial rules that came out a year ago, and now they are tentatively moving forward, it looks like, in these rules to start the process, certainly for social use, and I think delivery is also supposed to be part of the picture. And so we'd like to see later this week are actual rules of setting the stage for these new license types. The social consumption piece is likely to start with a pilot program that they want to pick, say, 12 towns or cities that would have some limited ability to grant social use licenses under certain circumstances. So we're really looking to see the specifics of what they're going to go as they venture into this brave new world that runs into a whole bunch of issues, especially concerns over intoxicated patrons who would be driving home potentially and causing public health and safety issues. So that's really coming. That we really need to see exactly what they're going to propose. It should be interesting, but it's been an issue that has been really focused on by the commission. They really want to make it happen. One thing I'll say before I stop, and you can ask questions on it, is that it's one of the other parts of the Cannabis Commission's DNA, is that they really want to try to help communities who've been disadvantaged by the marijuana trade and the marijuana enforcement policy of the past. I know that's a particular interest of yours. I've heard some of your past podcasts on that. It's something that I know has been tried in different places. Massachusetts has, at least theoretically, a set of policies to foster community growth and beneficiaries of the cannabis revenues into these towns and communities that have been adversely affected by the cannabis trade. And anyway, what they're trying to do with this new licensing types is that they're likely to limit the licensees for a period of time, such as 2 years, to those who've been adversely affected by the cannabis policies of the past, or also people who are minorities or veterans or other disadvantaged groups. So they're likely to have it so that you have to have a majority of disadvantaged persons will be the ones who will be the license applicants for these new license types.
That is actually very good to hear, because there are some states that prohibit licenses going to anyone who's been convicted of a felony. which is really a shame because so many of the people who are probably the most knowledgeable about the plant are people who were convicted of possession of it early on. And then they're not able to actually contribute to or benefit from the industry. So I'm really happy to hear that. And is Massachusetts also going to be exonerating people who have been convicted of cannabis crimes?
I'm not sure. I don't know that I've heard that that piece of it is going to be in play. I may have just missed it because it's the issue of the criminal justice implications of the change in marijuana policy is not something I've focused on. So it could happen, but I don't believe I've heard that in the state to date. And maybe again, that might be something that'll be looked at in the upcoming legislative session. But yeah, there's several people on the commission, including the chair, Stephen Hoffman, who seems very committed to the issue of having understanding the social justice implications of cannabis licensure in businesses. And there's also Commissioner Title, who is another one who is very, very committed to this and is very focused in on trying to make sure that that not all the license benefits at the company level go to, say, the big corporations who own the big medical manufacturing facilities in the state. They want broader benefits to be distributed across the state, and especially in the towns like parts of Boston and parts of some of the cities, the smaller cities, and all across the state who've had high levels of cannabis arrests in the past.
And also, I think that by inviting the disenfranchised communities to participate in the cannabis program in the state, they're also eliminating the potential for the criminal element, the black market trade of cannabis, to be prevalent in those communities as well. I would think that would be a very smart move.
I think that's exactly right, Snowden. It's something that is part of the picture here. They really want to make it so that it'll be a self-sustaining, growing industry that benefits a whole spectrum of individuals in the state. And I'm glad that they're taking that. The issue is that it's hard to do. For example, there was a special licensing benefit called an economic empowerment applicant who would be able to, if you apply, you'd have to have a majority disadvantaged persons in your group, in your license group. And if you apply, then you would be able to have preferential processing speed. You'd also have some fees waived and that type of thing. And I think my understanding is that few, if any, of those economic empowerment applicants have made it through the process yet. I think it's just hard to be able to have that type of business. It requires I don't know, it just requires a lot as a startup business in a new industry, and they haven't been able to get people across the finish line yet. But I think they're still trying hard to make that happen, at least in expanding and working in different directions. They're also having special training programs for people who are disadvantaged so that if you qualify, then you get access to employment training and skills training and other benefits that'll be, they'll just in, again, certain fee waivers in order to really encourage people to get in the business.
You read my mind with fees because I was going to say, it's one thing to qualify for the license, but when it comes to actually starting up a business, the disenfranchised communities are going to be the least likely to have the funding to go ahead and implement a business that they qualify for. So that's interesting that they would have some considerations in terms of fee reduction and that sort of thing. But are there also groups out there who are specifically looking to invest in those underserved communities? In other words, help some of these potential business owners get a leg up? Because that's a challenge, I would think. It's expensive to start these businesses.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. I think the answer is yes. A lot of the businesses are being cited in these different cities and towns that qualify as disproportionate impact communities. And so that's part of it, is that they will, they're there and they can hire local talent. But the other part is that one of the policies that you have to have as part of the licensing scheme is you have to have a plan for how you're going to benefit areas of disproportionate impact. So I think many providers, when they will commit to giving a plus to people who live in these towns when they're making